There's several. If you didn't get them now.
Good morning, a good day. See, I notice that we have a good number of visitors. The Ottersbach family is especially well represented today. And welcome you to our services. We are beginning a new course of study, beginning a new quarter, and we will be studying the book of Judges. Material looks like it's still available in the back if you want. We got this material from another congregation. It's been put together by one of the Broadwells, and it has been used before, so it's tried and true, although I'm sure we'll find some exception to it along the way. But I welcome you to, if you're going to be with us, going to be persistent, or if you're just curious about the material, you can pick up a copy and we can print some more. But I encourage everyone to get one of these workbooks. We'll be using it as a guide for us in the coming weeks as we're studying from the book of Judges. Let's begin. So let's start our study with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we come before you this morning thankful for all the ways that you've been mindful of us. We're especially thankful for this opportunity we can assemble here in peace and in quiet and consider things from your word. We pray that you'll guide us to learn the things that you've preserved there for us, that we will learn lessons that will be useful to us in rendering our service to you here. We pray that we'll do so in an encouraging manner, keeping an open mind, looking to see the guidance that you provide to us. We're aware, Father, that there are those that are away from us for illness or reasons beyond their control. We ask that your blessings be extended to them and the hands that minister to their needs, so that they can soon return to our work and worship together. Father, forgive us of our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. This first lesson is I guess we're not actually getting very deeply into the text, but it's about the book itself, what we can determine about when it was written, the period of time that it covers, the nature of this particular period of time that for the children of Israelites, children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob that have been delivered into the land that Abraham was promised. You remember anything about the terms at the point where Abraham was promised this land? And you remember anything about those promises that God made to Abraham? Certainly. Okay, he was promised that his descendants would become numerous, which is a pretty big reach because he's kind of at the point where he's given his promise. He's not got very many descendants, but nonetheless, this is something that God promised to him, that he would have his descendants would become very numerous, and they would be given a land to dwell in. Did he specify which his land was? He did at the point where Abraham, where he's blessing Abraham. At this point, Abraham has occupied a section of this land, kind of moved into it, keeping his animals on it and such, and he lives on it. But he actually owns very little land in Canaan at this point, in which God extends his promise to him. And so he's asking a lot of Abraham. He's asking him to have a lot of imagination, to think about, this man of almost no descendants will in fact father a great nation. And they, in fact, will occupy the land. And at one point, he goes up and he points him. He says, "Look as far as you want. That you will from the great river all the way to the two rivers." Basically, he promises is that this land could be that of his descendants, and that excited Abraham. I think he kept it pretty well, but he also put other stipulations on it. You recall any other stipulations about that promise in Genesis? How soon would this occur? Several generations away, because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Okay, so part of what God was doing in bringing Abraham's descendants out of Egypt and leading them to Canaan was to fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham, of that great nation would have a lot of land in which to dwell, they would be able to call their own. even though they didn't hardly own any of it at the time. They would have no claim to be able to make to this other than by conquering. He didn't actually stipulates all that, but he also puts in there because the iniquity of these people, God's long suffering with the people in this land, hadn't been expired. He still hoped that there were righteous people that were dwelling among them, and he could convince them that he was the one true God and to have them stop serving their idols. He didn't, I'm kind of inserting that parenthetically. He doesn't say that outright, but he is long suffering during this period, and it's in fact, we're going to find out that it's going to be over 400 years before all this happens. A long period of time. About the same period of time that we're talking about that the book of Judges covers, as it turns out. I read a book toward the end of the last, it was written, I think, in the 90s by a guy named Bill Russell. And he wrote this book about his dad. Big Russ is the name of the book. And Bill became kind of famous during the 90s during some of the political coverage and such. He was one of those news guys that grabbed up a whiteboard and started drawing on it and such, during the elections in the 90s. And that kind of set him apart. Is that everybody else was kind of hand waving, but he was actually drawing on a whiteboard. And he became very popular, and he wrote this book about his dad. And his dad, he introduces it, and this is the first time I can remember hearing the phrase, the greatest generation. This is a phrase that maybe you recognize, maybe you've heard, and maybe wonder who they're really talking about here. They're really talking about the generation that fought the Second World War, that sacrificed, that sometimes enlisted early, and in fact banded together with nations all over the globe to defeat this great evil. This is characterized by this generation of people, and they're not characterized by whining and complaining a whole lot. They're characterized by hard work and dedication. Sure, there are flaws. There's lots of faults associated with them, but in fact, that this was in many ways called and given this nickname, I guess, by their descendants, the greatest generation. I will characterize to you, at least in my mind, this is an editorial for me. This isn't written down in the book of Judges, for instance, but for me, the generation of Israelites, the descendants of those who were delivered from Egypt, were in fact Israel's greatest generation. Those that conquered the land, those that carried out God's instruction, and God helped them every step of the way. They followed. God gave them guidance. He gave them direction. He, in fact, fought for them. He used the weather and hornets and all kinds of other things to punish the Canaanites when his patience finally ran out on behalf of the children of Israel, those descendants of Jacob that occupied the land. When God is talking and giving direction to Joshua, Joshua 1, verse 8, he tells Joshua, anywhere you put your foot can be yours. In other words, you can have all that you're willing to walk to. Any place you're willing to conquer, I'll be by your side, and will enable you to do that. Those are the conditions that Joshua was given. I mean, that's fantastically generous. He doesn't give him the river bounds and all that kind of stuff, but he's basically saying, take what you want. Can you get a better offer than that? And in fact, that was the charge. He relayed those instructions then to the children of Israel, and those were the marching orders that they were given. They were given more specific instructions, but they in fact were instructed then to conquer the land with the idea that they would completely drive out the people that were in there. They would subdue them completely and drive them out wherever possible. If for no reason or other reason than they wanted their stuff. God was promising, you can have their gardens, you can have their houses, you can have their cities, you can have their wells. You can have all their stuff. Now, what did the children of Israel do to be able to deserve this? They were born, basically, right? They were the beneficiaries of God's generosity and the promise that he made to Abraham 400 years prior. But they still had to follow instructions. And in fact, this generation seemed to be pretty serious about following the instructions that God gave them. They seemed to be very serious about keeping the feasts and to establish the altars and keep the sacrifices and follow the law and enjoy that benefit. They at one point, having conquered a good bit of the land, they begin to become somewhat complacent. They were actually hadn't gone out and scouted out and divided up the parcels and cast lots to determine which tribe would get which lots. They were kind of began to kind of rest on their laurels even during the conquering stage. So there's cracks in the armor. We're beginning to see a tendency that God later talks about, and our author calls to our attention at the bottom of page 5, where I like to quote from Deuteronomy, and I'll read that here. Now, therefore, write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. And this is in Deuteronomy. This is before the conquest actually gets underway. This is instructions to Moses that God is giving here. For I brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, which I swore to give to their fathers, and they have eaten and are full and have grown fat. And they will turn to other gods and serve them, despise me and break my covenant. And when many evils and troubles have come upon them, this song shall comfort them, shall confront them as a witness. It will live unforgotten in the mouths of their offspring. For I know that they are what they are inclined to do, even today, before I have brought them into the land that I swore to give. So despite the fact that this generation of Israelites was notable, was impressive in their dedication to following God, and in their accomplishments, that they didn't do this single-handedly. They did do it because they were a finely honed military fighting machine, and they had the superior leadership and guidance of the greatest military minds on earth. Well, except for the fact that it was God providing them with guidance, of course. But they didn't do this out of their own prowess. They did it with God's help. But nonetheless, it was their accomplishment. And God, even here, can begin to see how fickle these people are. And they were, in fact, the descendants of their fathers, all of which who died in the wilderness, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb and their families were spared that death in the wilderness and were the only surviving members of the previous generation. This, to me, kind of sets the stage. And that God here can actually see the tendency that in fact, when things are starting going their way and they're not having to conquer, in life they begin to enjoy some of the spoils, that they become distracted. And their distractions were beginning to show even at this particular point. Joshua is witnessing this too. And the quote from Joshua, after he invites them to choose this day who you will serve, but for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And the people said, yes, that's our choice too. But Joshua pushes back and he says, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God, and he will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do harm and consume you after doing you good. And the people said to Joshua, no, we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourself, that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, yes, we are witnesses. They started out with the very best of possible intents, but it didn't really work out that way. And thus we have the occasion for studying the book of Judges. The book of Judges covers a period, if you add up all the periods of oppression and how long all the judges how long they judged, it adds up to a longer period of time than in fact that this period affords. This period is about 325, 350 years, which makes it one of the longest periods. If the author here calls attention to 12 recorded periods that are across the top of the chart on page, that should be page 7. My pages are sticking together. Yes, this you have to go landscape here. Landscape, not portrait. So you can see the periods of time across the very top. And if you've never actually done the math and such, you start looking at those periods and comparing them and such. This is one of the longest periods of recorded history in terms of the way these periods are delineated. This is not a small period of time. It's slightly less than the than the period that they were in fact, sojourning in Egypt. Sojourning is an accommodative phrase. They were suffering as slaves most of the time. So it's longer than the United Kingdom. It's longer than the captivity in Babylon. It approaches being as long as the period of the patriarchs. It's a long period of time that we're looking at here. And if you, the author actually does the math and encourages you to do the math at one point. I think we have a table that delineates that. Also here at the bottom of page 10, that if you add up all the years of oppression and deliverance, it comes out to about 410 years. And that suggests to us that the judges overlapped, that they were in fact in different geographic regions, again, cataloged for us in the middle portion of the chart here. There's a east of the Jordan and a west of the Jordan and south, the portion to the very south. And the activities and such of the various judges and their oppressors and the oppressors of the land, which point being is that this was not a unified nation. This was a confederacy. Their king was supposed to be God. God was their designated leader. It was a theocracy. And they were supposed to look to God and his agents for leadership and direction. But in fact, they began not doing that. And when they began doing what they wanted in their own heart, because there was no king in the land, which we hear oftentimes at the end of the book of Judges, they strayed considerably. And so they didn't act as a unified nation except during the actual conquering. And even then, there was some fragmentation. If you remember, some of the tribes actually liked the land on the other side of the river. And I think God applauded them for their initiative. He allowed them that. I think that was an amendment. I think that initially what God promised Abraham was all west of the Jordan. But in fact, that these people liked territory and were willing to fight, and to leave their designated territory and fight with the rest of the nation as a nation. That all of the tribes came together to try to fight to conquer the land. I think this pleased God to no end, and so He rewarded at least some of the tribes that wanted land east of the Jordan, the Transjordan, with letting them have their wish. But they didn't always act as a bloc. And in fact, very seldom acted as a bloc. And these individual oppressions, these individual uprisings that oppressed, and talking about oppressing Israel, it was oppressing some of the tribes, whether it was the Midianites or the Moabites, or whoever the oppressor was, it was kind of localized. Thus, the judges, the deliverers, were actually localized as well. This term judge is an interesting one. It's one that the word that's used here is, interestingly enough, it's not the kind of judge that's deciding cases and rendering decisions, but rather it's one that leads. And the author there in the middle of page 6 talks about the different words that are used here. And only one place, and there's one of the speeches in Joshua 11, in which the only one that someone that's actually spoken of as judging is God. Acting as a judge, that is, someone who is able to interpret and to make law. These weren't those kinds of guys. They weren't those kinds of leaders. They better understanding, I think, as a word maybe besides judge, but someone decided to, and it's what the scriptures actually calls them in Judges chapter 2, is saying that when God raised up judges, he used this word, this sopete, that and it has a verb form that talks about the actually judging, the act of judging. Those are the terms that the book uses for these people. If we were choosing titles, we might choose a different one. I like deliverer. That in fact that we were introduced to a cycle here of sinning, or a cycle of decline that we see among the people when they become lax. Their allegiance to God grows soft. They begin to serve other gods, and God lets them suffer the consequences. Sometimes allowing, and so the consequences, God didn't have to intervene, because as it turns out, being occupiers and not following his instructions to cleanse the land of the people that were in it, God didn't have to search for people to oppress the children of Israel when he wanted to get their attention, did he? They were built in. Okay, if they had followed God's plan, God might have had to go out and prompt somebody to come in and want the land. And as it turns out, the wanting the land here, this was a pretty choice piece of territory, as it turns out. Most of the neighbors coveted the land, but the Hivites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Amorites were pretty serious about defending it. And that's what caught the Edomites and the Moabites and the Midianites. That's what kept them at bay. Was in fact the people that were occupying this territory were pretty fierce about defending it. So they weren't a pushover, and it's a good thing that Israel had God's help in conquering the land because, given how fickle that they were, and at least that maybe the generation before that died in the wilderness, and the subsequent generations that didn't seem to be very good at holding to the plan, that God may have just allowed nature to take its course. But that's a lot of things going around here. These folks, I think, would be leaders. Leaders would be a good term for them. They would, but in most of the cases, they were being sent in, and God chose them. He raised them up to deliver the Israelites from their oppression when they began to regret their actions. And they saw the error of their ways and began appealing to God. They may have left God behind and began serving idols and ended up having someone come in and to oppress them and take their land and enslave them and tax their crops or actually take their crops and all the stuff that comes from being occupied by someone that doesn't like you. And they would lament that. And when they began to appeal for God for deliverance, God took pity on them and he raised up a deliverer and helped that deliverer to quell this particular enemy and try to restore the balance of things. In some cases, not always completely. There's a lot about, and I don't know that, especially if you didn't know that we were even studying this material, that you've given it much thought. But part of the instructions God would give them, he would give them very sometimes unorthodox plans as to how to conquer cities and portions of territory and such. And military tactics that are kind of sketchy, that don't seem like they'll make sense at all. But the people involved, this greatest generation who were paying attention, they said, marching around a city is not the same as attacking the city. And if you've got a really fortified city, yelling at it's not going to make very much difference. But they followed their instructions in faith, and God repeatedly delivered on his promises to be able to reward them. Repeatedly delivered and gave them victories over the people of the land and gave them their houses and their wells and their gardens. God delivered on his promises repeatedly, and these people were taking notice of that. The people that was happening firsthand, live and in person to, they took notice of that. The two faults is that I don't think that they did a good job in transmitting that down to their children. I don't think that they instructed their children properly about how it is that they came to be in this land. Their children may have just grown up thinking, well, mom and dad worked hard for all this stuff, and I get to live I get to live as a beneficiary of their household, and didn't explain to them in adequate detail about what all God had done for them. The people the survivors of the surrounding lands, the people that they displaced, they knew the stories though, and I think that they did a good job of telling their kids about it because those grudges remained for centuries. You want to talk about people that can hold a grudge. I mean, the Canaanites and the Midianites and the Amorites held a grudge because they didn't like the fact that somebody else was living on their property. And that stuck in their craw quite literally for centuries. So there was plenty of opposition, but that could have been eliminated, couldn't it? You recall the instructions again. Anywhere you go, you follow my instructions, I will give you victory. Anywhere you put your foot, you can own. But when you get there, don't leave any survivors. If they leave, if they run away, chase them out of the country and don't let them come back. God's plan was for the children of Israel to occupy this land all by themselves and with no other influences or interference. How did the children of Israel do in following those instructions? Poorly. I think they got mixed. The results charitably could be called mixed. In fact, they did follow the instructions to conquer. And they occupied the land, although not all that God promised to Abraham, but they occupied the central portion of this land. And eventually they got around to marching it off and dividing it up into parcels and allocating it out to each tribe. They eventually got there, but it was on a smaller scale than, in fact, what God promised. As a footnote, eventually Israel would control all of this territory. It would be over 400 years later that they literally controlled from the Euphrates to the Nile. That was under Solomon's influence. And it's great. It's great an influence. Israel was veritably, genuinely a world power under Solomon. But this greatest generation accomplished the mission, so they thought. They in their own minds, they had accomplished the mission, but they didn't displace all of these people. And in fact, these people ended up being, God was also able to use, and he took notice of this as this developed. And he, in his mind, he said, well, I can use these people. I can use these enemies, these people that I've run out of patience with, and that I intended to be exterminated or eliminated from the land. The fact that an incomplete job was done, I can actually make use of that. Do you recall the use that he decided, what use these people would be to him and his plan? And this is getting ahead because it's actually in the 2nd chapter of Judges. Randy?
Well, he used them to I don't want to say tempt the Israelites, but to make them suffer.
Yes.
For instance, Joshua even was partook in when he made an agreement with the Gideonites. Who was the Gideonites, where he made an agreement with the attack.
There was some trickery again.
They said they would serve them, right? But we won't attack. No, God didn't say that.
That was an aberration. And again, they lived with the consequences of that, but they also extracted as you said, they enslaved the people. They didn't destroy them, but they said, your generations will be our servants as long as you're living.
Sure.
So there was a balance there, but it was an accommodation. But you're right, the word rather than tempt, God says test. I will test my people's fidelity using these enemies, using my former enemies that they didn't follow my instructions and being able to displace. Well, they will be handy when I want to punish them, or I want to test their fidelity to me. And in fact, God announced that. That was what's expressed in the book of 2nd Judges, which we'll get at next week. So these people were in the land, but they weren't. God was still treating them as part of the plan, even though they were not part of his plans initially. His plans initially was when his patience ran out with the people in this land that he announced to Abraham was to exterminate them, or at least displace them in a way that hopefully that having with the nation, if the nation of Israel had continued on in the path of this first generation, if they continued to follow that kind of dedication to keeping his feasts and following his will, and to behave like they were God's people. They were the people of a holy and jealous God. If they continued to remember that and behave that, then they'd probably still be living here to this day. That's bold talk, because I can make that statement because there's absolutely no way to prove that. But I mean, that was God's intention, is they could live there under those terms as long as they were willing to follow the terms. At the point where they deviated from the terms, though, despite the fact that there was all this will be the property of your descendants forever, that had conditions attached to it. And there's a lot of that language we have to understand in the context of those conditions, is that all those promises were conditional on their obedience to God. The promise to Abraham wasn't conditional on anything. The only thing that hinged on was God's ability to fulfill his promises, which couldn't be higher. You know, if we were rating that on a scale, if we were giving him a credit score or something like that, what's the top credit score, like 850 or something like that? God's would be like 8,000. There's no one who is capable of delivering his promises more than God. That's the high end of the chart. And that was the only thing that he didn't put any stipulations to Abraham or the descendants, really, at that point. When he made the promise to Abraham, his delivering on his promise by the conquest of the land, he delivered on completely. And you might point out, well, what about the Gibeonites, or what about these people that are listed in the 1st and 2nd book of Judges that they failed to drive out? Why did God lay down? Well, it's not God laying down, it's the people laying down. They lost their ambition. They lost their desire to follow his instructions completely. And as a result, that sets the stage for this cycle that develops here. This cycle that is actually published here in one of the charts also, I think on page, in the middle of page 9 here, this circle here. This cycle is one that is repeated. It's actually described in chapter 2 in about verse 16 and 17, of the fact that there would be not only the slippage, there would be actual sin encroaching upon the nation that would separate them from God's graces. And that because of that sin, God would punish them. He would punish them by basically allowing nature to take its course. He would just let their neighbors who coveted their land and coveted their stuff have their way. And at the point when they finally woke up and they said, and finally kind of came to their senses and began to appeal to God, then God would raise up a deliverer. And the deliverer would come in and remove the oppression. Would he restore them back to where they started out? And you weren't prepared for this because it's not specifically in the lesson. It's part of the cycle, the way it's described. It's really a downward spiral. Okay, we see this cycle repeating over and over about a dozen times here in the book. And in fact, we see it repeating as a united kingdom. We see it repeating as a divided kingdom. We see that that's the nature of these, that's the nature ostensibly of mankind, but certainly of these people to get complacent, to allow sin into their lives that separates them from God, God to allow them then to receive the fruits of their poor decision making until they begin to seek Him and being tender-hearted and being merciful and being gracious. God intervenes to deliver them. But He doesn't, the deliverance is always to a lesser state than they were before. They're losing cities. They're losing people. They're losing territory. They are not being restored to their former glory, the glory that this greatest generation provided to them. So from that point on, really, they began to lose territory historically during this 320, 350 period year. They are on a decline, even though it's a cyclic decline. They have peaks, but they in fact have eroded their territory until the days of David and Solomon. To some extent, Saul was they were into one of those periods of erosion when the people began. They came up with the solution. They said, "We figured out what's wrong. We need a king." And we need the kind of king that can lead us into battles. We need somebody that busts heads and takes names. And you find us a king like that, and we'll go back to being in charge. We'll go back to where we belong. And that didn't work out all that well, as it turns out. Historically, that decision doesn't look like it was a very good one. It gave them a brief respite. And again, this world power era that Israel enjoyed under Solomon, it was even more influence, even more prestige than what the conquering nation, the greatest generation, was able. I keep using that term. You may not like it, but that's to me that's what this period is representing. The conquest of Canaan was a high point, but they began losing ground almost immediately. Before the next generation died out, they started to lose ground. And it was a back and forth throughout their history all the way to that point to Solomon. Again, Solomon was a big high point. World power status is nothing to sneeze at. But after Solomon, what happened? Divided kingdom. And that was the beginning of the end. A steady decline there, both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, ultimately nearly to the destruction. Althea?
The problem was they already had a king.
Exactly. And that, in fact, was a problem. And it's not that God didn't forget that. That was the system that He put in place. It was His idea. The people living in the land began to think about them having delivered all this and getting all this abundance and such of their own hand. Or even worse, began to attribute it to that of the foreign gods they should have displaced. If they had displaced all the people in the land and had torn down their altars and destroyed those heathen places of worship like God instructed them to, this wouldn't be a problem. This is quite literally a problem of their own making. And I say that because I'm looking in the mirror, right? How many of us find ourselves in similar situations? And if we really are honest with ourselves and we do an honest assessment and do the fault analysis, we have to concede that, I got here on purpose. I arrived here because I made that decision, and that wasn't the only way that this could happen, but I happened to get here because of my own doing. It takes a lot of agonizing reappraisal to get to that point. But while we're criticizing these people and finding fault with them as such, you should keep the mirror handy, because their journey is very similar to ours, and we can retrace their footsteps. You know, that philosopher that says those people that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, this is that. This is our opportunity. This is why we're studying the book of Judges, so that we can peel apart, we can dissect this cycle in detail, not just so we can answer questions on game shows or, you know, win the Bible trivia questions. That's not the point. The point is to use that, hold up the mirror, and to have that introspection, and to get to go through that agonizing reappraisal and said, you know, I've been warned about this. I've got myself into this jam mainly because of this. I at least cooperated with it. I may not have instigated all of it, but they couldn't have been done without my cooperation. And to make that honest assessment of ourselves, of the nature of human beings, the nature of very nearly all people who strive to follow God. That nobody is immune from this temptation or immune from this set of circumstances. You're saying, well, you know, we don't have the Balaam here. I don't have to worry about that. We've made up idols of our own. We have plenty of other distractions, things that draw us, that come between us and God. Those are our idols. Whether it's our careers or finances or our families or prestige or politics or whatever it is. So whatever it is that comes between us and God puts us in this cycle. And we are going to be masters of our own destiny in that. So we should pay careful attention to what these people are doing, and not just denounce them as ignorant dunderheads or been uninformed or willfully ignorant and may just historically poor decision makers. But we should use this opportunity to learn about this nature of sin and the cycle that it produces, so that we can be better afforded to try to avoid it. Absolutely.
And he would have destroyed many times the Israelites, but he had one thing in mind: the seed promise to Abraham and the day that he did it.
That's a terrific point here. Is that they were here, they got here because of God's willingness to fulfill the promise, and it wasn't a matter of their merit. And in fact, so long God intervened, and so long as they were willing to go through the motions of fight, even in what seemed like silly tactics, He was willing to intervene and give them victories. At the point where they quit cooperating, where they lost their ambition, He didn't fight their battles for them. He promised to do that. He promised to help them to conquer the land. At the point where they became satisfied, where their taste for conquering diminished, He didn't continue on the battles, even though there were still enemies to be defeated. There were still instructions to be followed. God didn't do those on His own. He was going to do that cooperatively with these people, give them a blessing that was well beyond the effort of what they put into it. But if they weren't willing to put in the effort, He wasn't continuing on with the extermination process. And in fact, was wily enough, was clever enough to be able to realize and said, this could be useful. These people say that they choose me. And Joshua said, no, you don't really mean that. You know, if you make this pledge now, it will be a witness against you. And the people said, let it be a witness. That's our intent. And God said, you're on record. I count that vow. I've written it down, and we'll see how serious you are about that. And He will use the people. Sometimes He used people who way far away. Often it was the neighbors, but many times the oppression came from within. You know that horror movie meme, the calls coming from inside the house? That's the kind of situation that this was, that the call was literal. He didn't have to look around for enemies to oppress the children of Israel. They were built in because the children of Israel didn't follow their instruction. It didn't have to be this way. This is as a result of choices that they made. I probably hammered that pretty hard and need to move on. These charts, I think these charts are great here. And this one's a little confusing because you have to zoom in, zoom out. All of this stuff down in this timeline here is this little block right in the middle at the top here. And when it talks about the 12 periods, it makes the 12 historical periods that are in the Bible, they're all written for you right there across the top. So if you got a question on that later on, you know right where to look that up. And this is, he actually kind of even throws in what's going on in Egypt down here, what's at the same period of time. So this is a cool kind of chart. I appreciate that he went through the trouble to pull all that together. Also, the chart on page 9 of showing the individual judges at the top, what's going on with the cycle here, and this is really good outline stuff. If you're ever having to put together a lesson about this, this book falls into what the way the Jews divided up the Old Testament books into the prophets section. It is I consider it historical because it is as a historical document. I value Judges a lot because it's a warts and all account, right? When you read, I think about a lot of the history that I got in grade school and such, in my history and civics classes and such, and it was slanted. You know, it was borderline propaganda, you know, looking back. I mean, there was what I learned about manifest destiny and the colonization of North America and such was, you know, omitted a lot of stuff, let's say. This is a warts and all history. Okay? There's no polishing over the bad stuff. When people are evil, people are bad guys, they have flaws, like almost all of these judges do. It talks about them right out in the open. Not to denigrate them, but to accurately record history. And so I think the warts and all kind of history are extremely valuable, not only because they're more interesting to flesh out the details and to understand the people involved, but they lend accuracy. You know, the kind of polished history that omits these character flaws or omits these mistakes that people make and such are suspect, frankly. That means that they've been polished. And you got to wonder, well, what are they leaving out? And here, this is so warts and all that I'm feeling like we're drinking right from the source. That we're getting the actual recounting of the events, so that we can make accurate judgments. The Spirit preserved this for us because we are the children of Israel. We are God's people living in a different generation, but we are no less human, no less subject to the same distractions, the same poor judgment than they are. And so their lessons, what happens to them, are something that we can learn from. This is actually what Paul writes about in Romans chapter 15. He says the things that were written before time, before you heard examples, not just so you can learn the plan of salvation, not just so you can learn the promises of Abraham, but so you can observe how people live that are trying to serve God and gain from their experience. That's what we're going to do. That's the high nail that we don't need to lose sight of while we're going over all these histories and circumstances and periods and kings and armies. That's why we've chosen to study the book of Judges this term. It's not just because we haven't looked at it in a while, and there may be somebody that's a little soft on some of the facts, and we need to sharpen everybody up. Those are good things. But we ultimately need to learn about what it is these people went through so that we can avoid making the same kind of errors that they do. So I like that. I would rather this being in the historical books myself, but this is what's considered the former prophets. And of this, there's these judges, there's these ones that our author calls out as being major judges. You know, they're in bold on the table and such. And those that were minor, that minor because he grouped several of them together in a chapter and doesn't give us very much details about them. But there's and again, the assertion is that these overlapped. That Israel wasn't acting when it talked about Israel being oppressed. That was localized tribes, cities, and villages. And the deliverer came in and delivered those localized tribes, cities, and villages, along with maybe across the Jordan, going on at the same time. There's another deliverer who's delivering tribes, cities, and villages from a different oppressor. And so that's the stage here, that they're not oppressing Israel as a block. It's not like this the nation of Moab came in and subdued the entire nation, all 12 tribes of Israel. But there's some genuine losses, and this idea about not being fully restored, that's genuine. The one tribe, Dan, got chased off their property. They got displaced, and the displacers wouldn't allow them back in, and so they ended up having to migrate. They ended up having to forfeit the property that they were initially allotted, and go out and basically take over another city and the surrounding area to call their own. These are the kinds of things that we see describing, again, in the actual history of the children of Israel during this particular period. There were some in the middle of page 10, there's some interesting historical landmarks. This is clearly, the book introduces itself as saying after Joshua died. In one of the judges actually takes, when one of the attacking nation brings a grievance and begins attacking him, he says, well, that's, you're bringing up something that happened 300 years ago. Couldn't you have intervened in the last 300 years to make this right? Why pick now to try to make it, try to balance the scales? So that says that there's been at least 300 years since they conquered Canaan. The book of Ruth occurs during this time, and Ruth, that book is introduced by saying during the time of the judges. So it clearly happened during this time. And then later on, when Solomon actually begins the temple, we've got another historical landmark. It's 480 years since the children of Israel have passed. And so that's very clearly in this period. And I think that's interesting references to be able to frame all of this. We'll start in with the lesson number 2 and look at the first 2 and a fragment chapters in the book of Joshua, or Judges rather, next week. Thank you.